First essay. Does anyone have a topic yet that they'd like to volunteer? You don't want to volunteer? What? You might help other people. Come on, it's okay. Do you want to share for her? Does anyone else have a topic yet? This is 1:30 your grade, people. So if you have any questions, you really need to ask me. It's coming up, I think, on the 24th of February. The first one is due. So we're just 3.5 weeks away, halfway there. Okay, no questions, none of that from me. Could you turn that on? Is that on? It's already on? Okay, thank you. Okay, so today I want to finish up on British empiricism. I want to show you it's a relatively short video, but after the video, I'm going to flush out a little bit more about how we're hardwired and why that limits us and how we end up dealing with it. And then I'm going to have about a 15-minute discussion with you that I would greatly encourage your participation in, that we have conversation back. If I have a question I want to ask you, it's to provoke thought. It's kind of a thought experiment. And then we'll go back into, we're about to start Western philosophical thinkers. We'll finish today with Socrates and the Socratic method. And then on Thursday, we'll talk about Plato and something called the allegory of the cave and how he thinks knowledge is acquired by us. So let me show you the video. Now, this guy talks very fast, but he's actually very good at what he says. And I wouldn't worry too much about having to remember all the detail, but it will set the stage for our conversation. He's going to point out, how do I say this to you? You know, we all have access to reason. 2 weeks ago, in the second week of the semester, we talked about logic, both deductive and inductive logic, and how it's an interesting tool. But you're not born with capacity, so you have to learn that, just like you learn mathematics. You learn plus and minus, and then on that we build another layer called multiplication and division, and then on that we build another layer. That's not in you. Those are things that have to be taught, so your thinking skills are channeled in such a way that you can make sense of the world that you live around you. That's what happens with deductive and inductive logic. Well, you're born with experiences, with perceptions. We're hardwired to see things certain ways, but we all don't see it the same way. And we have to learn how to refine those so that we all kind of come to a general agreement about what's going on in the world out there. I don't know if I give you this example, maybe the first day of class. Infants, when they're born, usually the first thing they focus on is their mother because they're the ones who feed them and they warm them and things like that. We discovered that you can take a picture of a mother's face and cut it up in pieces and put it in any order you want to on a flat surface like a panel. And the infant will recognize that that's its mother for the first 2 months. And then if things aren't in order, it doesn't know what it's looking at. So from the very beginning, the brain tries to visually order the world that we live in. Half of the brain, they say, is devoted to spatial arrangements. So if you have someone, I've read some things about this, you have people who are maybe born blind, maybe there's a cataract. If you wait too long and remove it, they have a hard time understanding what distance is. They can learn that, but they have to learn it as an adult. Children learn it right away too, but they're not in the classroom and not going through some kind of learning perception. So how we organize perceptions is very important to us, and it's a learned experience. So this gentleman is going to talk about how we perceive the world and how we organize this information. Why is it important? Well, we've kind of learned how to do that, but once we have this information, what does it mean? Knowledge or information is your database. Just because you have information doesn't mean you understand it. So understanding is the second level of knowledge. How we put this information together gives us a worldview. We call it a worldview. But above that, we have to understand how to apply that knowledge. That's called wisdom. So we begin here, and that's where this gentleman in this video is going to begin. We all have perceptions. We see the world. It comes into us through senses, and we kind of put it in an order. And we're designed that way. When you're an infant, you don't sit down and say, gee, I better put all these spatial arrangements in order so when I walk, I don't bump into things. When you go through your teenage years, it's known that your body accelerates in growth. And so what you have accustomed yourself to in terms of distance, suddenly you grow 6 or 7 inches, and the joke is, well, teenagers are always knocking something over because their hand-eye coordination suddenly changes. Their body has changed, and their brain has to readjust to that distance so that they participate in the world the way that gives it the best order. Everybody follow what I'm talking about? The same thing will happen when you get older, too, and you start to shrink. People joke about that, but you will shrink as you get older. Gravity works against you at that point. And I see many older people, they go to reach for something and knock it over, and they're confused what's happening. They have to readjust their perception when it comes to distance. So we start with knowledge, and we move to understanding. This gentleman is going to talk about understanding. This is called British empiricism. There's 3 that we usually look at. The fellow named John Locke, we're going to look at him specifically. Then there's another fellow called George Berkeley. We don't have to look at him. And then there's another fellow named David Hume. We're not going to look at him. Locke probably gives us our best understanding that we can relate to for how we put this world in order. And then I want to talk about this, maybe a 10, 15-minute discussion. We can go all the way down the rabbit hole with it if you let me. So we understand what I'm doing now? Okay. So that being said, again, this gentleman's going to talk a bit fast, easy to understand as long as you keep up with him.
Share your passion with the world.
By the time we're done today, I just might have you questioning whether this apple is real or not. Think I can't do it? Give me about 10 minutes. I might have you wondering whether I'm a physical object or not. And the same goes for all this stuff. And for your computer, and Nick behind the camera, and you. How? By unleashing the power of empiricism. Last time, we learned about 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes and how he upended the apple basket that was his entire personal belief system and descended into a radical skepticism, only to emerge with his conviction that cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This one idea, the fact that he was thinking, or really the fact that he was doubting, allowed him to build back up one by one more beliefs that he thought he could rely on. But in the end, most of the beliefs that Descartes ended up putting back into his intellectual apple basket had to do with the immaterial world. Like, he decided that he could believe that he existed as a thinking thing, and he believed that God existed. Ultimately, he lit upon the idea that some of our thoughts are clear and distinct in a way that somehow guarantees their truth. But a lot of philosophers disagreed. They argued that thinking on its own wasn't enough. Like, just because you're thinking doesn't mean that your thoughts correspond to material reality in any reliable way. Basically, Descartes' philosophical opponents thought that the cogito was a dead end. So here we start to see a split between 2 different understandings of how we can most reliably get to the nature of reality, and therefore truth. Both were responses to the constant questioning that is skepticism. On the one hand, there was rationalism, and on the other, empiricism. Descartes, like Plato before him, was a lover of reason. He met skepticism with rationalism. He believed that the most real things in life were ideas, propositions that can be known through pure reason. Deductive truths, which we talked about before, fall into this category, and mathematical truths do too. But by contrast, empiricism is based on the principle that the most reliable source of knowledge isn't our ideas or our reasoning, but our senses. Sure, we can know things through deduction and basic logic, but what actually leads us to truth, or at least gives us our best shot at getting there, are things like induction and the scientific method, ways of thinking that tell us about the material world. Probably the most famous split among philosophers between these 2 camps was the lifelong debate between Plato and Aristotle. Plato was convinced that truth resided in the immaterial world of ideas, while Aristotle's attention was focused firmly on the ground. But what about in Descartes' day? If he was the original prototype of the navel-gazing philosopher, a living example of rationalist thinking, then his foil was the 17th century English thinker John Locke. This is where he was born. Locke believed that we are all born as tabula rasa, or a blank slate. He argued that all knowledge is obtained through experience. He rejected the concept of innate ideas, the view that we're born preloaded with certain information, like what's good versus what's bad, or what is the nature of God. Locke thought that we are born knowing nothing, and instead all of our knowledge comes to us through sense data. But one place where Locke agreed with Descartes was in the idea that just because your senses tell you something, that doesn't mean you can trust it. After all, sometimes your senses give you false information, like when you think you see or hear something that's just not there. Descartes' response to this, of course, was to just throw out out all sense experience as an unreliable source of knowledge. But Locke didn't go that far. Instead, in order to figure out whether the senses accurately reflect the outside world, he introduced a distinction between what he called the primary and secondary qualities of all things. Primary qualities are qualities that physical objects themselves have. They're not in our minds, Locke argued. They're actually in the stuff. These primary qualities include things like solidity, the density, weight, and mass of an object, and also extension, the height, depth, and width that a certain thing has. He also included figure, or the shape of an object, as well as mobility, which is this, whether it's stationary or in motion. So primary qualities, Locke said, belong to the thing itself. Take this apple. It weighs maybe 150 grams, it's the size of my palm, roundish but firm with the slightest bit of give, and right now it's moving through the air. Those are its primary qualities. But it has secondary qualities too, and by Locke's standards they are not real, at least not in the objective, agreed-upon way. They're just in our minds, but they get there through the primary qualities. I'm talking about things like its color, taste, texture, smell, and sound. The secondary qualities of this apple are its redness, how it tastes and smells and feels on my tongue and hand, even how it sounds when I bite into it. Locke believed that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities explained the disagreements that we all have about our perceptions of the outside world. Like, we could measure this apple in a bunch of different ways and all agree on its primary qualities, but its secondary qualities would no doubt lead to some disputes. Like, is it really red? What kind of red exactly? Cardinal red or carmine red? It's kind of dark purple at the top, or is it just like a dark pink? What about the sound it made? Would I call that crunchy or crispy? Or I don't like that bitey? It's like apple sound. We could argue about that kind of stuff till the cows came home. But if we disagree about its primary qualities, one of us is simply wrong, because primary qualities have nothing to do with you or me. Instead, they have everything to do with the object itself. Locke's reasoning was simple, even elegant, extracting a lot of explanatory power out of very few basic concepts. As a result, it resonated with a lot of people, and one person it resonated strongly with was the Irish philosopher George Berkeley.
Okay, Berkeley's too weird for you, so I'm not going to introduce you to Berkeley. Berkeley thought there was no such thing as material stuff. It was all based on perception, so the idea of the perceiver is the one who gives reality to it. As long as I'm perceiving, it has reality. What happens when I go to sleep and I'm no longer perceiving? Does the world disappear? Well, he invents too the God concept. God's a constant perceiver, so while we're sleeping and the world disappears, God says it doesn't disappear, so when you open your eyes again, don't be surprised it's still there. That's kind of too deep and too odd to go through. In fact, he thought he was the philosopher of common sense. That's how weird Berkeley is. But we study him, and I'm not going to bother to introduce you other than more to point out that I don't think we should go and study him. But what I do want to talk about is, this started with metaphysics. Locke's very interesting. There are certain things about the world that seem consistent to all of us when it comes to how we view the world, our perceptions. Anybody put their hand through this? Well, you might be able to force your hand through it if you're a student of martial arts, but the reality is this is pretty solid. We all see that. So he comes up with these things, width, breadth, height. And then there are these secondary qualities. And these secondary qualities we can disagree about. Are they really that relevant? For me, the only kind of red is candy apple red. Everything is tainted to either the purple side or the orange side. Chevy makes a car and they call it red and it's really orange. Porsche makes a car and they call it red and it's really orange. But that's my perception of it. Now, why is that important to us? Well, it isn't. Unless you want to begin to qualify yourself as a thinker, which is what philosophy is all about. Philosophy is the one thing that most people who go into further or higher education or develop their skills to a high enough level, philosophy then becomes integral, not because of what we discover, but because we learn how to think through issues that may or may not be important. For instance, I think it was